Right. Hi. Hi folks, good evening and welcome. I'm just starting a little early just to get the Zoom kicked up. We're all on. Just make sure. Right, okay. I'll just check that those of us participating on Zoom can hear me. I'll just stand over here to make sure. Everyone can indicate with a thumbs up or something if you've got the camera on. Thanks, right. Just a couple of notices before we start. The two new books, York Area Insight and Life in York 100 Years Ago, are still on sale at the bookstall, latest publications. Got my own copy the other day. I noticed there's one or two errors, but you know, it's a fascinating book. But the other thing is that Nick Bealby has arranged a walk next Wednesday, the 19th. Now, the St. Lawrence's one was so successful, let Nick have his way again. And he's going to do a tour of the York Civic Trust's City Enhancement Project sites. Things like the Etty statue, coats of arms, the Capital Maintenance, and the Memorial Gardens. So Nick is going to give a tour of 8 sites. And hopefully we're going to break up for a coffee afterwards. I don't know, but Nick didn't say he was buying, but we'll see where we go from that one. Now, so next Wednesday afternoon, we start at 2 o'clock from the new restored gates near the hospital, down Hospital Lane, the old gate to the old Archbishop Hall Gates playing field. So those gates are where we'll be starting at 2 p.m. And Nick will be taking us on a walk around town, showing us all the sites the Civic Trust have been upgrading over the last few years. It's that slow garnishing of the city. I think when he and David Fraser gave a talk to us about 3 years ago, I mentioned it was the opposite of smashing old mill windows. It's the slow repair of things instead of the slow decay of things. And that's what I think the Civic Trust has done a great job with. On to tonight's talk. Dr. Tania Dickinson at the University of York on the Acomb Assemblage. Her research has primarily been with Anglo-Saxon burial customs and burial rites. And let's face it, most Anglo-Saxon archaeology, most buildings were wood. So what we have of our early medieval forebears are bits, they're gems. And of course, Tania's done a great deal of work on the Staffordshire Hoard, the joint publisher of a publication in 2019 on the Staffordshire Hoard. I hope she might take a few questions at the end. That's all right, thank you. Those of you on Zoom, I shall try and monitor the chat and see if I can put your questions to Tania at the end. So without further ado, I shall leave you with Dr. Tania Dickinson. Thank you.
Oh, good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk about the Acomb area treasure find. I first heard about it actually late in 2017, so perhaps a bit after some of you caught up with it. Tipped off by Elsa Mainman, who in turn, of course, had been told by Peter Adaman. Of course, got this to work.
Do it that way, put your cursor on.
And then press this.
Yeah, that's easy to do.
This seems very complicated. Apologies then, the changing slides is going to be a bit arduous. Anyway, it was instantly obvious that the fragments had come from a composite disc brooch, which is top of the range jewellery in the 7th century, and a bead necklace, and most probably had derived from a high status early Anglo-Saxon female burial. To find such a brooch this far north and such a burial in this part of Yorkshire was exceptional, marking them as potentially of considerable importance, particularly for the history of early Anglian York. However, the extreme fragmentation and uncertainties about the discovery constrained interpretation. The pandemic and university strikes have also conspired to impede completion of my hands-on research, though I think what remains to be done is unlikely to change my argument significantly. The find was reported on Thursday, the 12th of May, 2016, by the owner of a property in Acomb, who brought it to Rebecca Griffiths at the Yorkshire Museum. Rebecca is the find's liaison officer for the Portable Antiquities Scheme, the PAS, and she created immediately a database record for the find, and she took the picture that you've just seen. She recognised that potentially it came under the terms of the Treasure Act 1996. That is, it's an object that's at least 300 years old and contains more than 10% precious metal. And so she also initiated the formal treasure procedure. 4 days later, she and Adam Parker visited the property to undertake a short watching brief investigation of the find spot, of which more later. The find went to the British Museum, which submits treasure reports in England to the local coroner, and it was duly declared treasure in March 2017. The York Museum's Trust wished to purchase, and so it was referred to the Treasure Valuation Committee to assess its market value, and hence what compensation would be paid to the finder of the landowner. In this case, £2,800. Now, under the Code of Practice of the Treasure Act and the protocols of the PAS, the finder's name and the precise location of the find spot are confidential. The circle on my map is a 1.5 kilometre radius based on Acomb Parish Church. However, in this case, the finder went to the press in reaction to his failed contestation of the official valuation, during which he had attempted to auction the material online. He thereby put his name and his own photographs widely into the public domain. And because his business interests are also listed online, simple internet searches will find the address. It's sufficient for my argument and permissible to show you that the find spot, in fact, is in the northwest part of Acomb. The assemblage was reportedly found on Monday, the 9th of May, while using a post hole digger to dig a narrow pit in the garden in order to replace a fence post. As told to Rebecca Griffiths, the find was first detected at a depth of about 2 to 3 feet at 60 to 90 centimetres. As a sub-spherical soil compaction within looser sandy soil, which the finder opened to reveal copper alloy fragments and then loosely sieved the remaining material. The 2017 press reports more dramatically quote the finder as saying, "Then I spotted something green in the ground and realized it was a copper pot which had turned green in the moist environment. Then I saw fragments of gold gleaming in the soil." wonder, can we turn these lights on or not? It's really shady. Okay, that's great. Unfortunately, by the time of the washing brief, the new fence post was already concreted into position, and further exploration was actually restricted to a narrow flower bed infested with tree roots. So only a narrow trench of 70 by 30 centimetres could be dug down beside the post to the bottom of the concrete at some 80 to 90 centimetres in depth. The bottom 40 to 50 centimetres comprised apparently sterile brown soil with occasional pebbles, but no evidence of disturbance, ancient or modern, apart from the concrete post hole. Between that layer and the topsoil was 17 centimetres of loose sandy soil, full of brick and tile, charcoal, 19th and early 20th century ceramics, and post-medieval glass, including a bottle fragment which bore the date 1910. This layer probably relates to the house building that took place in this part of Acomb from the 1930s onwards, though the plot in question was not developed until sometime between 1951 and 1962. The treasure then was seemingly ex situ and probably also already partially fragmented. A couple of weeks later, the house owner brought to the museum 5 pottery sherds, which he said had been found whilst gardening. One is possibly Anglian or Anglo-Scandinavian of the mid-7th to mid-10th centuries. 3 of them are medieval, 13th to 16th centuries, and the last one is post-medieval. He also produced another glass bead and 3 tiny fragments of copper alloy, which came from sieving the leftover soil from the excavation, and a single cut garnet, which he found when enlarging the excavation hole beneath the concrete fill. These were added to the treasure find. So the main source of evidence for the original nature of the deposit is the assemblage itself. By the time it was shown to the museum, it was already thoroughly separated and clean. There's a fine clay film over a few of the fragments, and there are sandy grains that survive only in the crevices of the goldwork. 2 tiny black fragments were initially thought to be parts of a jet bead, but are in fact coal. If those were disaggregated from the other material from the soil compaction or from the surrounding soil, they would add to the evidence that the find was ex situ in a modern layer. I'll start with the beads and then go on to discuss the much more complicated matter of the brooch fragments. The fractured blue glass bead with white and red overlay and the translucent turquoise bead are not typologically distinctive. But the blue cylinder is a classic late Roman form that survives into the early Anglo-Saxon period and occasionally even into the 7th century. Another characteristic bead type of the late 5th and 6th centuries is amber. And again, those do occur occasionally in 7th century contexts. They're always in very small numbers compared with the earlier century. Much more striking is the barrel-shaped bead, which is probably a 6th century import from the continent. And the remainder of the beads that you see on the screen are 7th century. The small wound spiral bead, which I've outlined in blue, is an archetype of the middle 2 quarters of the century. The other wound green beads are not quite so consistent in shape, but are probably also of similar date. The 2 large annular beads, with their bodies inlaid with a twisted cable of glass, are another type fossil of the 7th century. Among some 20 known examples spread all over England, there's an exact parallel to the turquoise bead from a rich secondary burial at Hornby on the North York moors. And there's an example in apparently black glass from the extraordinary high status Christian site at Street House, Loftus. So overall, the 12 beads look like a typical 7th century necklet or short festoon. Now, reconstructing the fragments of the composite brooch depends on first identifying its parts and then comparing those with other examples. Composite disc brooches consist of a sandwich of 2 sheet metal plates held together by paste. The decorated upper plate, which to me is confusingly also called the base plate because it's the base for the decoration, has a cruciform layout of a central and 4 subsidiary garnet set bosses with cloisonne and filigree panels between. These brooches developed at the end of the 6th century or beginning of the 7th century in Kent as a deluxe version of the 6th century garnet inlaid cast silver brooch. With a plated form, a cast silver base with an applied decorative gold plate as a probable intermediary form. And in a couple of instances, we actually have hybrids of the plated and the composite brooch form. There's a very important distinction to be made between composite brooches with cloisonne walls and a base plate of gold, with the back plates usually of silver, the one on the left, and those with copper alloy cloisonne. The base and back plate are also of copper alloy, but the back plate sometimes silver plated, the one on the right. Since 1975, when Richard Avent compiled his corpus and classification, the number of composite brooches has grown to 26. 10 in gold, which includes the 2 hybrids, come essentially from Kent, apart from the single repaired brooch from Harford Farm, Norwich, which was the most northerly composite brooch known until the Acomb area brooch appeared. The Acomb brooch increases the number of copper alloy brooches to 16. As you can see, they're much more widely spread. They're first still in Kent, but they are predominantly found in the Thames Valley, the South Midlands, and to a limited extent in East Anglia. Composite brooches were constructed from front to back. First, the cloisonné cell walls were soldered to the base plate or set in paste on it. There's the cloisonné wall, there's the base plate. You can see where the walls would have been. Then the cells were infilled, first with some more paste, then a cross-hatched gold foil to reflect the light, and then a garnet or other inlay. Second, filigree was applied to the base plate if it was gold directly, or separate applied panels were inserted. Third, the bosses of metal, a white material, and garnet were inserted. And then a reeded strip rim was applied to the base plate, its back filled up with paste, and the whole thing sealed by application of a back plate, which already had the pin and catch plate fittings attached. Now, unfortunately, the 60-odd little copper alloy sheet fragments that are extant from Acomb lack any indications, such as soldering scars or rivet holes, to tell us whether they are from the base or the back plate. And there's no rim or catch plate that survived either. What we do have is a fragment of the iron pin. Moreover, this bears textile fragments and the corroded iron is attached to a drum-shaped pin box that housed the pin hinged. And this diagram on the right is of one of the brooches from Milton Northfield, Oxfordshire, and it shows how these rather complex pin fittings worked with the hinge put through a loop within this drum-shaped pin box. The Acomb drum has given readings of low silver lead alloy on its side and a tin lead alloy on its base. Presumably that's from the solder which had fixed it presumptively to a silvered backplate. Much easier to identify are the decorative elements from the brooch's front. The central boss and 3 of the originally 4 subsidiary boss settings are represented by their gold basal collars and garnet set mounts, the bigger in each case being from the central boss. The actual white boss dome, which would have been held within the collar, they're of course missing, but would probably have been made of shell, ivory, bone, or some mineral aggregate. Each collar is a simple upright piece of sheet metal, which is then trimmed with a beaded filigree wire. The garnet set mounts, which sat on the top of the white dome, consist of an upright or convex collar that's soldered to a gold base plate. There's the collar and there's the base. And that thus sort of held the cabochon inlay. Behind the inlay is a copper alloy rivet, which passed through the base plate into the white material dome. Though how much further it penetrated is not known, since all copper alloy rivets are broken. On some, but not all composite brooches. Those rivets actually go all the way through to the back plate. The collars of the mounts are trimmed with 2 filigree wires. On the central mount 8 and one of the subsidiary mounts 11, these consist of a lower beaded wire and a plain upper wire. Though on the latter, on the central one, the central, the plain wire has got unsmoothed helical grooves, which have been left from its manufacture by twisting a block or rod. The other 2 mounts have 2 beaded wires, but the beading tool has been applied with very variable pressures and angles, and all of this suggests a less than accomplished or fastidious jeweler. Mounts 8 and 11 contain garnets. Number 9 lacks a garnet, but there is a loose one in the assemblage. And mount 10 seems to hold some sort of dark glass and is perhaps a replacement. Of most importance to the reconstruction are the 14 4-sided gold panels filled with simple filigree amulets made from spiral beaded wire. One panel is noticeably poorer in craftsmanship than all the rest and is possibly a replacement. But surprisingly, that panel has a higher gold alloy, 76 to 79% gold, than the average, which is about 64 to 70% gold. And curiously, the other discordant alloy return is much lower, 55 to 57% gold, but doesn't seem to be technically inferior. You can probably see that that 7 of the panels are longer than they are tall. They have a slightly convex side opposite a slightly concave side, and a straight side opposite a definitely concave side. The other 7 panels are squarer but irregular, with 2 adjacent concave sides and 2 adjacent straight sides. Comparison with 3 Kentish composite brooches, and in particular the splendid gold brooch from the rich Barrow grain Kingston Down 205, shows that our brooch must have had 2 rings of filigree panels, originally 8 in each, which were set in pairs either side of the subsidiary bosses and rectilinear cloisonné arms. The more rectilinear Acomb panels come from the outer ring, the squatter ones from the inner ring. And you can perhaps compare what you saw in the previous slide. The position of the smaller radius concave sides in all cases indicates whether the panels came from the left or the right side of the boss. Now, this image comes from a fairly recent study by Anna Isbell, who used Kingston Down as one of 5 case studies to argue that designs of composite brooches were laid out with a compass and straight edge according to very simple ratios, which created a framework of axes and concentric circles. all started with boundary, outermost edge, and the outer cloisonne border per dimension 1. And this has provided a very useful first step for my reconstruction, though since Kingston Down is manifestly a far more regularly laid out as well as expertly made brooch and Acomb, you can't use this as a straight model. Rather, my model combines the theoretical dimensions that are suggested by Kingston Down, actual dimensions which are recoverable from the relatively few Acomb fragments that can be measured, and manual manipulation of digitized outlines of the filigree panels. So these are their real shapes and their positions. They're not, of course, I can't say where all the way around they've already gone. With a dimension 1 of approximately 80 millimeters, the computed rim diameter is 93 millimeters, which will make Acomb even bigger than Kingston Down, which hitherto was the largest of all the composite brooches and has a rim diameter of 85.5 millimeters. But without a rim for Acomb, we can't check my measurements, and probably inexact tooling would explain some of my apparent measurement discrepancies. But there's no doubt Acomb was a very big brooch. The nature of the cell work that filled the 3 rings of cloisonne, which I numbered 3, 5, and 7, can only be inferred in outline, however. There are a dozen fragments of cell wall, most of them showing very slight curvature, but 2 on the left have a zigzag profile, which I think means that they're probably for a honeycomb type setting of pentagonal cells. There are also 2 pieces of calcium-rich backing paste. You can see one there at the top. There are only 3 extant garnets. They're wheel cut and flat polished. 2 are roughly rectangular, about 1.5 millimeters thick, and 1 is perhaps a half mushroom shape. There are 27 gold backing foils. Most of these were cut as rectangles, but mainly at a diagonal from the much larger sheets of foil that was stamped with a die to make a simple cross-hatched pattern, which is known as the standard type of pattern. And this is an example of that simple cross-hatching. It's incredibly fine. There are 4.5 lines per millimeter, which is really quite remarkable. There are also 2 foils which have the slightly more complex box grid pattern, but it's obvious that the dies for each of those is different in quality. This is a really fine one, and that's really quite sloppy. Now, when a garnet is inserted into a cell, the foil sides usually become bent upwards. So it's the undersides of the foils which give a better guide to the cell shape. 9 of them are rectangular, 8 are pentagonal, and 2 are triangular, of which the one I've shown you on the left is scalloped shaped. The remainder are variously trapezoidal or polygonal. The simple geometric shapes of the Acomb cloisonne are like the simple filigree. typical of the copper alloy series. And they contrast to the complex cell work and multi-motif filigree of the gold series, such as Kingston Down. But many of the parallels in the copper alloy series do suggest that simple rectangular or trapezoidal cells would have framed the subsidiary boss sections. And probably the large rectangular garnets and the boxed foils would have been used at special places in the design, the cardinal points, as you can see here on Kingston Down or West Harry, the large, extra large cells. Now, as one-off products, a family tree of composite brooches is elusive. The technical and decorative attributes cross-cut Avon's classification and the distinction between the gold and copper alloy series. Nevertheless, many studies have consistently agreed that there is a chronological and regional evolution. The absolute dating is now firmly anchored by the 2013 publication of a chronological framework for Anglo-Saxon burials, which was built by mathematically modelling high-precision radiocarbon dates with seriations of grave assemblages. In this table, I've marked with a dagger the 7 assemblages with composite brooches that were used in that study. All of them were assigned to female phases D and E. That is, burials that were deposited between the very end of the 6th century and about 680 AD. Coins provide termini postquem for 3 of the burials, and there is a radiocarbon date for a 4th one, and I've marked those brooches with asterisks. And put the dates down the left-hand side, and you'll see that they seem to be quite consistent with a layout of the brooches that attempts to embrace technological, typological, and stylistic variables. And that includes animal ornament, which I've indicated with underlining, which is something that, thanks to the research on the Staffordshire board, we now know far more about. So in short, manufacture of the gold series began at the very end of the 6th century. And it continued probably into the 3rd decade of the 7th century. It's concentrated in Kent, and it's there that it seems to first provide models and then for craftsmen who are switching to copper alloy and more simplified Poisson and filigree, and then later to craftsmen further afield. And the switch is probably to be explained because of the decreasing access to both gold and garnets in England by the 3rd decade of the 7th century. The production of the copper alloy series probably then went on from about 625, 630 to about 660, and perhaps some of the really poorly executed brooches might represent the end of the production. The Acomb brooch fits very happily into the main copper alloy series. The probably replaced filigree panel and the cabochon inlay suggests that the brooch was perhaps some age at burial, and perhaps, like many of the other examples, was damaged and incomplete not only before discovery, but before burial. Acomb's ultimate inspiration, as I suggested earlier, lay in Kent with the two filigree ring brooches from Kingston and Faversham, but it need not have been made there. Its other really close relatives are the Oxfordshire cluster of Milton Northfield and West Hannay. Moreover, the spiral beaded wire of its filigree panels is rare in Kent and in East Anglia, but it's a distinctive element of the Staffordshire Hord's more northerly Anglian complexion. So in sum, the brooches and the beads comfortably fit with items found in female burials deposited between about 630 and 680. The textile fibre on the brooch pin confirms that it did come from a burial, where it was fastened a mantle or cloak at the chest in Roman Mediterranean fashion. The material wealth and ostentation of the assemblage, especially the brooch type and size, imply that the deceased came from a high status family. And probably the grave once contained other items which have not been recovered. Now, in the 7th century, and especially in the middle quarters, burial practice underwent a marked change. Substantially furnished female burial saw a resurgence in popularity after a period of absence. And such graves were characterized by a distinctive suite of objects. Composite brooches are relatively rare and stand out for their ostentation and prestige. More typical are small pins for veils, necklets of beads and of precious metal pendants, and objects that can be associated with domestic roles, such as textile working, with curative or protective powers, notably the so-called work or reliquary boxes, and notice we have one again from Hornby, and items that have religious identity, such as overt crosses here on this necklet, or again associated with composite brooch at Ross Hall, this pendant. This increased investment in female graves may be explained as a product of increased competition amongst an expanding land-based aristocracy, in which particular female members both embodied and was responsible for conserving the family's rank, rights, and good fortune. And the role seems to have been enhanced by active engagement in Christianity within the home and from the mid-century onwards, sometimes as members of aristocratic monastic foundations. Whether alone in new small burial grounds or added to long-established cemeteries, richly endowed burials, often marked by mounds, signified at death a woman's and her family's importance, and the commemoration, even veneration beyond. Providing a specific historical context to the is more problematic, given the absence of an archaeologically atypical location. Within York, the closest known early Anglo-Saxon burial ground to Acomb is the single cremation urn from Severus Junction, about 1.5 kilometres away. Further east again, we have the mixed rite cemetery at the Mount and the cremation cemetery at Heworth, beside major Roman roads beyond the fort in Colonia, which attest to an Anglo-Saxon presence in the 5th and 6th centuries. But otherwise, there are only a few stray finds, such as gurgle hangers, scattered close to the walls that might indicate destroyed later 6th or 7th century furnished burials. With the hanging bowl from Castle Yard, the sole clue to a burial or a high status burial of the 7th century in York. Instead, essentially unfurnished West-East burials start to appear from the later 7th century in Micklegate, and then into the 8th and 9th centuries, Coppergate and Sparriergate, Fishergate to the east of the fosse, and east again at Lamel Hill on the moraine. And it's there too on the moraine that we have evidence of early Anglo-Saxon farming settlements at Kimberlow Hill and Heslington Campus East, which were abandoned just as the settlement kicked off in York, particularly along the riverbanks. If we widen our vista to Yorkshire, then early Anglo-Saxon burials are notable for their concentration on and the edge of the higher ground, especially the wolds, and they're avoiding the Vale of York apart from York itself. A line of predominantly cremation cemeteries of the 5th and 6th centuries marks the start. Admittedly, only one of those sanctioned is a real big estimate of single burials, and that does suggest a deliberate statement of social difference. But the majority of the burials that you can see there are inhumations, whether isolated graves, small clusters, or larger cemeteries. They show a marked association with Roman roads and with pre-Anglo-Saxon monuments, especially Bronze Age barrows and on the wolds with linear dikes. And that pattern changes very little over time, except in the 7th century, if you can focus your eyes on the blue and orange dots, which are smaller, they are increasingly appearing on the high wolds and occasionally in the North York moors and the Yorkshire Dales. I've recast and updated Tom Pickle's map to focus strictly on burials that are furnished and datable to the 5th to 7th century, and then drawn attention to those that contain 7th century gold artifacts, because those clearly are the most relevant analogies to the Acomb assemblage. I've also added in chance finds of gold, which of course are mostly metal detected. And some of those probably represent disturbed, destroyed burials, but not necessarily all of them. And again, you can see the preference for high ground is very clear, with the only arguably relevant item, the Escrick ring in the Vale proper. The rich 7th century burial in Acomb is quite surprising. However, Acomb sits on the northern part of the York moraine, the sand and gravel ridge which facilitated routeways across the low-lying vale and early settlement within it. Acomb Church lies at the highest point, about 34 metres OD, whence the land radiates in 3 spines if you take the contour at about 20 metres OD. The land drops gently to the west, but more sharply towards the Ouse, and thus potentially offers a characteristic horse-crest location for an ostentation. The fine spot is also not far from Deer Street, the Roman road from York to Aldborough. Though according to John Oxley, it might have taken a more dog-legged route from the Holgate Road along the higher grounds and through Acomb village, rather than the straight line projected by the Royal Commission of Historical Monuments. And west of Acomb, in Napton parish, aerial photographs and some recent finds indicate the presence of prehistoric burial monuments and extensive, if poorly defined, late prehistoric and or Roman ditch systems. So if the Acomb assemblage did reach its recorded find spot in soil redeposited from a burial in the immediate environs, it would conform with the leading topographic characteristics of early Anglo-Saxon burials in Yorkshire. An elevated position, close to a major routeway and to prehistoric monuments. It might be compared, for example, with the isolated situation of the composite brooch burial at West Hannay in Oxfordshire. If the redeposited soil came from somewhere else in York, as is speculated for the only other Anglian era find in Acomb, the 9th century sword pommel from Chapel Fields, then comparison might be made with the composite brooch burials at Covent Garden and Boss Hall, near the Middle Saxon wicks, respectively, of London and Ipswich. Either way, as the burial of an aristocratic and probably Christian woman or girl, Acomb would belong in the turbulent but sparsely documented story of York's Christianization. The period between the death in 633 of the newly converted King Edwin and the restoration by Bishop Wilfrid between 669 and 678, after a period of neglect, of Edwin's and his successor King Oswald's church of St. Peter. It might possibly also include the establishment of the monastic community under Bishop Bosa in 678 to 706, archaeologically represented by the broken grave markers under York Minster. The importance of ecclesiastical rather than royal power to York's regrowth at this time, which is argued very plausibly by David Rollison, is perhaps also visible in the distribution of York Greek gold shillings. If, as Tony Abrahams argues, they are episcopal issues of the 620s, 30s to the 660s. Their average gold standard of 55 to 66% is not far below the mean for the Acomb brooch of 65 to 70%. We might then envisage the person behind the Acomb burial as a member of a local aristocratic family, one of those which, according to Tom Pickles, adopted Christianity at an early stage to advance their secular fortunes. She might even have been a local example of his first generation of Yorkshire cradle Christians. Aristocrats like St. Wilfrid or St. Hilda, who were born and baptized during the initial conversions of King Edward and Oswald and played formative roles in the development of the church. But if the assemblage arrived at the reported find spot from further afield, or by some other means, then all my speculation is idle. Thank you for listening to me, and thanks to all those who have enabled my research.